When is the interval when we're supposed to go out for a walk?
One more hour, another hour after this.
How are we doing? Everyone all right? Good. We are just going to wait just one more minute as people join us, and then we will make a start on some study together. Okay, we have a wonderful number of people to study together, which means that it's going to be slightly complicated when we start trying to interact with one another. So a few little ground rules, I suppose I ought to introduce before we start. So the first thing is to say that I'm going to keep everyone muted, but obviously if you want to speak, I'll ask you to unmute. But please don't sort of try and unmute yourself and speak across other people, because we only have a short amount of time and lots of people. If you want to ask a question, the best way to signal to me is probably to try and put up your kind of virtual hand using the participants bit, where you go to yourself and try and put up a virtual hand. If you are on Zoom so I can see you, you could also wave your actual hand, this thing, and do that. And I'll do my best to come to you as well. But a virtual hand is a good way of doing it. Okay. And for this session, what you're going to need is just the study pack that you could have downloaded from the internet that looks a bit like this. If this is your first time studying with me, and so you've never come across one of my study packs before, then there is far too much material in it and we're not going to talk about it at all. Just so you know, that is my pathology of teaching, is that I will always prepare far too much material, but we're not going to try to look at it at all. But it's a way for you to continue to study it for yourselves later on if you want to. Let me just say a little bit of introduction, and then we're going to launch into doing some text study together. So, as you know, we are through today, each of the 5 Eilith clergy, studying a different line from the Vidui Rabbah, the great Vidui, which was first introduced in the Gaonic period, so 8th, 9th century, as a formal confession to be part of the services of Yom Kippur. When it was first introduced, it had maybe 8 lines in it and was kind of generic categories of confession. And then over time, it developed and evolved so that it then ended up with much more specific confessions of sins. And so it now, in its fullest form, if you were to look in an Orthodox Machzor, has 44 different confessions in it, presented as an alphabetic acrostic. Ours has 36 in its fullest form. So the form that we read and sang together last night has 36 different confessions in it. My colleagues, being my colleagues, all chose to study one of the ones that we actually say. And I thought it'd be interesting to try to find one of the ones that we don't do and work out what's going on there. So in the course of the next hour, we're going to look together at one of the confessions that's not in our Machzor, Al Chet Shechatanu Lefanecha B'Kalut Rosh, the sin that we commit before you through light-mindedness, lightness of mind. And we're going to explore together what that means, what it's come to mean, and why it's not in our Machzor. And maybe at the end, I will try to explain why I think it should be in our Machzor, because actually I wonder if it might not have something really important to say to us today. Some of the confessions that don't find their way into our Machzor are not there for very clear moral, ideological reasons. So, for example, we don't say Al Chet Shechatan Lefanecha Bividat Zunut. We don't say a confession for association with impurity, for our failure to keep the impurity laws, because in our tradition we don't value those purity laws as being significant things that we would be concerned about. Other ones seem to have fallen out just because of repetition. There are a few that just sound too much like each other. We're going to try and explore why it is that Kalat Rosh has fallen out. So we're going to start with some Talmud, or some Mishnah and some Talmud, to try to work out what this concept of Kalat Rosh, lightness of mind, really is. And we're actually going to start by going to the other end and finding out about something called Koved Rosh, Koved Rosh, Koved Rosh. Okay, so in order to make this work, I'm going to ask people to read, and I will do it pretty much at random, but around my screen. Next to me is Henry and Loretta. So if I could ask you, one of you, to read from the Mishnah, that would be wonderful. This is Mishnah Brachot 5.1. The Mishnah is the earliest code of rabbinic law, dating to about 200 CE. Henry or Loretta, if you could read for us, that would be wonderful. I think I've asked you to unmute. There we go.
Sorry. We should not stand up to say tefillah other than with Koved Rosh, an appropriate state of mind. The early pious ones used to tarry an hour before praying in order that they might direct their hearts towards God. Even if a king asks after someone's welfare while praying, they should not answer. Even if a snake is coiled around their heel, they should not interrupt.
Great. So the Mishnah introduces this concept of Koved Rosh, heaviness or seriousness or weightiness of mind, and associates it with prayer, that we should approach prayer with weightiness of mind. Doesn't really tell us what that means, but it does give us some examples of things that we might do or might not do. The first thing is that it tells us that we should get ourselves into the right mood somehow. And the next line, the early pious ones used to tarry for an hour, is the origin of Psuke de Zimra, the section of the morning service in which we sing to get ourselves ready. So interestingly, the recitation of Psalms and singing together somehow gets you into the right frame of mind, possibly. So Koved Rosh might not be just about being serious. But then it says, we should be in such a state that if someone comes, if a king comes to ask after us, we just ignore the king. And if there's a snake wrapped around our heel, we just do it. So it's something about focus. Our ability to focus is associated with Koved Rosh as well. Now, the primary concern of the Talmud is often to try to work out how the Mishnah gets to its answers, how the Mishnah can justify itself in the context of the Talmud, in the context of the Bible in particular. That is, the first question that the Talmud will always ask of a bit of law is, what's the proof text? And so that's what the Gemara, the next bit of our traditions looking at this question, that's the question that the Gemara is going to ask. Henry, could I ask you to continue with the Gemara on that Mishnah?
Rav Nachman Bar Yitzhak said this: the idea of Koved Rosh is derived from here. Serve God with awe and rejoice with trembling. What is the meaning of rejoice with trembling? Rav Ada Bar Madna said that Rabbah said, where there is rejoicing, there should also be trembling. Abai was sitting before Rabbah.
Okay, why don't we, Henry, we're just going to stop there for a moment before we come to these two strange examples that we're actually going to skip over. So this idea of Koved Rosh is associated in the Talmud with a verse from Psalm 2. This is not the verse that's above our ark. The verse above our ark is Ivdu et Adonai b'simcha, serve God with joy. But there's another text which says, Ivdu et Adonai b'yirah, serve God with awe and rejoice with trembling. And this is identified as being the source for the idea that we should approach prayer with koved rosh, with a particular seriousness. What does it mean, rejoice with trembling? Rav Ada bar Natna said that Rabbah said, whenever there is b'makom gila, shem tehei ra'ada, in a place where there is joy, rejoicing, there should always be fear alongside it, or trembling alongside it. And that seems to be the idea that's behind koved rosh and why we might have a problem with kalut rosh. Now, what is that saying? Does anyone want to kind of try and articulate what's going on there? How does the text view happiness or joy or joyfulness or rejoicing or play? What does that text say about it? Quran.
You've got to be careful. There can't be too much joy, because there's also fear. There's also bad things going on.
Great. So there's this
with them priestly garments, the first fruits.
Someone if you are not muted, could you just make sure you're muted? Someone is also, this is one of the wonderful things we've discovered happens. People are in multiple services at the same time. So I think someone might also be in the martyrology at the moment. So you need to keep yourself muted. Great, Karan, thank you. So there's this this suspicion of joy. Somehow there's something dangerous or worrying about allowing ourselves to be happy, or too happy, or too playful. So we should always try to be as serious as possible. And the implication is, of Ivdu et Adonai b'yirah, is even where rejoicing is legitimate rejoicing, that is, even where it's in a place where it's okay, we should still be wary of it. So even the rejoicing, the joyfulness of simchat mitzvah, the joy of mitzvah, is still something we should be concerned about. The text is going to explore this a little bit more. So we're just going to jump past the next little bit, partly because no one really knows what it means. So one of the interesting things about engaging with Talmud is that often you find that there are things we don't understand. So Abaye is hanging out with Rabbah, and Abaye is just too happy for Rabbah's for Rabbah's liking, and Rabbah tells him off. And Rabbah says, "Rejoice only with trembling." That much is clear. Rabbah doesn't like people being too happy. What's not clear is what the answer that Abaye gives, which is, "I'm wearing tefillin," is supposed to mean. Okay, what that means, what that represents, is very unclear. Whether or not what it's saying is that as long as you're involved in a mitzvah, you can be as happy as you want, or whether it's saying that you can't really be happy if you're wearing tefillin, is unclear. So in the mind of the Talmud, this is relevant, but it isn't going to help us in working out what Kalat Rosh is. So we're going to jump onto page 2, and we have the same story in with another combination of rabbis, Rabbi Yirmiyah with Rabbi Zerah, and Zerah telling off Yirmiyah for being too happy. And he quotes a different verse, "In all sorrow there is profit," which means be unhappy. It's a verse that says being miserable is joyful, is profitable somehow. And Yirmiyah says, I'm allowed to be happy because I'm wearing tefillin. No one really knows what that means. But we're now going to get some stories. John Cohen, you are next to me. If you would be good enough to read, that would be great. Mar, son of Ravina.
Mar, son of Ravina, made a wedding feast for his son. He saw that the rabbis were excessively joyful. He brought a precious glass cup worth 400 zuz and broke it before them, and they were saddened. Rav Ashi made a wedding feast for his son. He saw that the rabbis were excessively joyful. He brought a cup of white glass and broke it before them, and they were saddened.
Great. Okay. So a place that we think we're allowed to have fun is like someone just muted me and then unmuted me. Sorry about that. So a place where we think we're allowed to have fun is in a life cycle celebration. but there's a problem with this here, which is that Ma at the wedding for his son and Rav Ashi at the wedding for his son see that the rabbis are having too much fun. So what do? They smash a glass. Not unlikely that this is the origin of the glass smasher at a Jewish wedding. And that when we smash a glass at the end of a Jewish wedding, what we're doing is articulating what this text articulates. So what is this text articulating? What is going on? What does this text tell us about our lives and the rabbinic view of what our lives should be like?
Well, it's reminding us of the destruction of the temple.
No, it's not. I'm sorry, Henry. You are taking knowledge from over here and applying it over here, which is a wonderful thing to be able to do, but it's not what it's saying, and it's really important. So another explanation for why we smash a glass at a wedding is the destruction of the temple, and so that gets read into this text as being the motivation of the story. But actually, that's not what it says at all. It doesn't tell us that there is a problem with the temple having been destroyed. It tells us something much more fundamental. What is the view of this story about having fun?
Limit.
Ilana. Oh, sorry. Danny, go on, Danny, and then Ilana.
Well, there's a limit. There should be boundaries to how much fun we have.
Great. Okay, Ilana.
I agree. Yes, you're just not allowed to have too much fun when you're Jewish. Sorry.
Right. So there's this fundamental thing here in this text which says being too light-hearted, being too happy is somehow in this text problematic for us. Oh, we've got hands up. Let's go for Selena, or it could be Andrew. I don't know who's got their hand up.
Selena.
Oh. We're playing around with the mute button. No, I was just going to say something similar, that it's just reminding you shouldn't be too happy.
Great. Okay. Harriet?
It's something to do about the question of why you shouldn't be too happy. And is it because that you need to be alert in some way, or that there needs to be some kind of balance, because balance itself is a higher state, perhaps, than being purely joyful?
Great. So the interesting thing about these texts is they haven't told us what the issue with happiness is here. Though the implication a little bit earlier on is that happiness is somehow in tension with the appropriate way that we should think about our relationship with God in the world. That is, there is a problem of being too happy, meaning that we're not kind of recognizing that we should be in awe and be sort of trembling at the reality of our lives. Robert, did you want to? You had your hand up, hand down, hand up.
I was just going to say that it could also, for me, it could also be having so much fun if you're not studying, praying, and learning Torah.
Great. So you can read the next text for us, which takes us in that direction, Robert, if you'd be good enough.
I haven't read it, but okay. The rabbi said to Rav Hamuna Zuti at the wedding feast of Ma, son of Ravina, "Let the master sing for us." He said to them, "Woe unto us, for we shall die. Woe unto us, for we shall die." They said to him, "How are we to respond after you?" He said to them, "Where is Torah and where is mitzvah that will protect us?"
So don't ask me to sing at Jenny's wedding, Robert, because I will sing, "Woe unto us, for we shall die. Woe unto us, for we shall die." It's an odd thing for someone to sing at someone else's wedding. It has to be said. So, and then the rabbis say, so he's asked to sing a joyful song in that moment. And instead he sings, "Woe unto us, for we shall die. Woe unto us, for we shall die." The rabbis say, and what's the refrain for that? If we're going to sing back to you, what should we sing back to you? And he says, where is Torah and where is the mitzvah that will protect us? What is going on? Okay, I'll have a go. So what seems to be going on here is that joyfulness is somehow inappropriate when we think about our relationships in the world and how we place ourselves in the world, and a recognition of our own mortality, of our own very temporary nature, should have us focus on that which is most important. And that which is most important is Torah and mitzvah, not having fun at parties. Right? So there seems to be a fundamental suspicion with the idea that we can have fun when we have limited time and we have a particular role in the world. So if you expand out this concept of Koved Rosh, what you end up with is the idea that if you're not doing that which is absolutely the right thing to be doing, you're doing the wrong thing. And the right thing to be doing is Torah. So Kalat Rosh becomes not just about, am I serious when I'm in shul, but am I serious all the time? Because all the time is when that's how I need to be in the world. And in that respect, it gets linked into another concept. So we're going to jump ahead a bit. You can look at some of the other texts as you go. But we're going to, on page 3, you'll see some texts which are specific mentions of Kalat Rosh. These specific mentions of Kalat Rosh are all about Kalat Rosh in prayer or in synagogue, right? So they are about the idea that when you go to shul, you should go to shul with a particular kind of head on. But we've just seen a big jump from that concept of Koved Rosh, Kalat Rosh, to a much bigger concept, which is it doesn't matter where you are, you have to be serious and you have to be focusing in on the big thing. And it therefore gets to be linked to a different concept, which is the concept of Latzon. And Latzon, interestingly, is in Al-Chet, where it is translated as for the sin we've committed by showing contempt. Which I have to say, I think is an awful translation, as we're about to see, because actually it's a much more interesting concept, and I think a much more difficult idea for us to have in our prayer book. So, Noah Fulton, it's lovely to have you with us again, live from the Ukraine. Would you be good enough to read? We're on page 4 from Avodah Zarah, the rabbis taught in a Braita.
The rabbis taught in a Braita, one who goes to a stadium or to an encirclement and sees there the conjurers and charmers, or the bukion, mukion, mulion, lulion, belrin, or solgurin, different types of clowns. This is a sitting of jesters or scorners. With regard to them, the verse states, happy is the one who has not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor stood in the way of sinners, nor sat in a sitting of scorners, but their delight is in the Torah of the Eternal. Hence, you learn that these bring a person to neglect of Torah.
Great, thank you. Don't go away because I'm going to ask you to read a bit more in a moment, but let's just stop for a second on that. So, this is a text in the tractate Avodah Zarah. So the general theme around it is questions of idol worship. Okay, and so these might be places where it's problematic that we go to them because idols are worshipped there. But that's not what this is saying. And the next text is going to reaffirm that. This is saying something different about what it is if we go to a stadium or an encirclement. An encirclement is like a military camp where they are having a party, hanging out, or goes to see conjurers or charmers or the clowns. Someone who goes to have fun. Someone who goes out to have fun is being told that there's a problem. And what's the problem?
They are neglecting Torah.
Great, right? They are somehow placing themselves in what this calls Moshav Leitzim, a sitting of people doing Latzon, people often translate, it's hard to translate because it's not scorn as we understand it, but a kind of scorn for the world somehow. They're not doing the right stuff that they should be doing. That is the opportunity cost of all of these things, is that they are not doing the other thing, which is Torah. Right? That seems to be the implication, okay? It's going to keep going with that idea a little bit later on. So we're going to skip the next line where it talks about you shouldn't go there, even if they don't do idol worship there. So let's not think this has anything to do with idol worship. And then see what it says, Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi. Noah, if you're happy to keep reading, that'd be great.
Of course. Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi taught, "Happy is the one who has not walked in the counsel of the wicked. This is the theaters and the circuses of idol worshippers, nor stood in the way of sinners. This is one who has not attended bestial contests, nor sat in a sitting of scorners. This is one who has not sat in antics. Lest a person say, since I did not go to the theaters and circuses and did not stand in bestial contests, let me go and sleep," the verse states. "But their delight is in the Torah of the Eternal, and in the Torah they meditate day and night."
Thank you. Okay, so this is essentially a midrash. It's a piece of rabbinic interpretation of a biblical verse. So the biblical verse is the one that we found at the beginning, associated with going out and partying or having entertainment of any sort. And it says, "Happy is the one who's not done these things. Happy is the one who's not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor stood in the way of sinners, nor sat in a sitting of scorners, but their delight is in the Torah of the Eternal." And the Midrash tells us that that is referring to someone who has not gone to do general entertainment, who hasn't been to the theatre or to the cinema, who doesn't sit and watch TV, who doesn't go out and go to the pub. And you can say you don't do any of those things, and therefore you're in a good place and you can just go and have a shluff. And it says, no, you can't even go and have a shluff because the delight is in the Torah of the Eternal, and in Torah they meditate day and night. So this concept the concept of Kalat Rosh is linked to this concept of Latzon, which is that all the time we should be dedicating ourselves to the study of Torah. That is the human purpose. And when we're not doing that, that is inherently sinful. And that's the question that is whether we want to have that in our machzor or not. Danny.
Isn't there another midrash somewhere, which is it attributed to Eliyahu or someone that walking through the marketplace, and he says, "Who is deserving of the life to come?" And he says, "No one." And then he spots two clowns, and he says, "They are, because they make people laugh."
Great. So you'll find that text on page 7. So I think there are other voices around. It's a pretty dominant voice, though, in Rabbinic Judaism that says we have to really reflect on what we do in our lives and whether we are being purposeful, and the things that we do which are not purposeful are actually, that opportunity cost is something that we should be confessing for and regretting and being sorry about. That's the challenge it's presenting us with. Now, we see that. We're going to read one more text, and then I want to stop for a minute and just see how we cope with this, because it's a really interesting question whether we like it, whether what we do with that idea. We see this in one more text really beautifully. So there's a little story at the bottom of page 4 from the Bavli again, from the Babylonian Talmud again, from Masechet Ketubot, and this is a story about the death of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Yehuda Hanassi is the person who compiles the Mishnah, also known as Rabbi. At the time of the death of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, he extended his 10 fingers towards heaven and said, "Ruler of the universe, it is revealed and known before you that I toiled with my 10 fingers in the Torah, and I've not derived any benefit from the world, even with my little finger. May it be your will that there be peace in my place of rest." A divine voice of Bat Kol emerged and said, "He will come with peace, they will rest in their resting places." That is, we are seeing as meritorious somehow this example of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who only engaged in Torah and didn't engage in any other form of worldly pleasure or worldly activity. And that seems to be the rabbinic model that we are being encouraged to aspire towards and to confess for not doing when we confess or don't confess for Kalat Rosh. Now, how do we feel about that? That's my question.
Miserable.
Thank you, Leslie. Okay, why?
Well, it's a very grim picture.
Bit more
All
detail.
joy. All joy.
Okay. Okay, so I suppose one of the questions is it a grim picture, right? I mean, is that, you know, is there something there about the fact that we do waste our time? We do not do the things that are important in our lives, right? That we don't ask those important questions about what's important. So is this necessarily miserable, right? And also, is it possible that we might find joy in the wrong things, and we could find joy in Torah if we just let ourselves, right? Simchat mitzvah, as it were. Noah, you've got your hand up. Thank you.
Well, it's a very tempting point of view, and it's something that's around not just in the rabbis, but in our world today with groups like effective altruism, and just this idea that, you know, doing the most good in the world requires some kind of strictness in our lives is like very, it's easy to grab onto. I can feel why it's so powerful. And on the other hand, like, isn't there a joy in this discipline? Like, as we read, like, the Torah is a tree of life, and those who hold fast to her are happy. And is that kind of a joy in itself?
Right. I mean, I think the rabbis would have felt that. That very rarely do they kind of push against the boundaries of the world that they place themselves in. Right? They are, they are considering themselves to be doing something joyful potentially. So it's interesting. I think there is this real resonance about some of what it's saying. I'm not sure it's an idea that we would want to reject in its entirety. This idea that actually it's worth us reflecting on the time that we waste and the time that we're not being the best of ourselves. Harriet and Lawrence.
Speaking for the two of us. So with joy. We were thinking that we get that point that maybe intrinsically through complete study, there may be joy by virtue of the act of complete immersive study. But what about, are there not specific commandments or demands on us to be joyful when, for example, Purim or Simchat Torah, aren't we? How do you reconcile those two things? Is there a contradiction?
Right. So I think one of the interesting things is that, of course, the role that they play is like the pressure valve in a lot of those communities where where you're allowed to kind of let go of this stuff because you have these 2 days a year where you can let go of it somehow. And of course, they're also very problematic, right? So there's a great deal of halachic discourse about how much you're allowed to have fun at Purim and how much you're allowed to have fun at Simchat Torah. It is not straightforward. And there are certainly kind of more ascetic voices in our tradition that say, hold on a minute, even these have to be much, much more balanced than perhaps they are allowed to be. Robert, you've got your hand up, and then I want to move on a bit. Oh, I may have just muted you. I apologize. There you go.
Is this where a lot of our say challenge comes from with the ultra-orthodox in terms of wanting to always study, not allowing groups of people who want to study because they're prohibitive, and to keep society separate?
Okay, so there's a number of different questions in your question, I think. I think that what it does speak to is one of the challenges around, particularly in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox position with regard to work. And the fact that within Israel, within the ultra-Orthodox Haredi world, often women will go out to work. Often those families will live on benefits, and or they will be paid to study by the Israeli government in order that they can only do this. Because when you take this to its logical extreme, the logical extreme of it is that if you are not studying, you are doing something wrong. and therefore you should be studying all the time that you can, and unless you're doing something else which is a mitzvah, and therefore the work is one of those problems, as we'll see in a minute. Okay, I think it's worth us recognizing how powerful this voice becomes in Orthodoxy. Before we think about what we're going to do with it, we should recognize quite how powerful it becomes. So over the next couple of pages, what you've got is some quotes from, or a couple of sections from a work called Mesilat Yesharim. Now, Mesilat Yesharim is probably the most influential work of Mussar, of kind of Jewish ethics, sort of like Haredi ethics, probably. It was written by an Italian rabbi in Amsterdam in the mid-18th century, and became very, very important in Eastern Europe, where yeshiva students would end up having to kind of study it by heart, learn it by heart. And its other big influence was it was very important in influencing the guy who went on to found Eshet Torah. So a lot of the ideology around Eshet Torah is also based around Mesilat Yesharim, this text, the path of the upright. And so if we just take a moment just to look at some of the ideas that he speaks to, we see how this kind of thing gets sort of taken to be a kind of, how it sort of blows out of control a little bit. So the text is based around a text in Avodah Zarah, which talks about Torah leads to watchfulness, watchfulness to alertness, and so on. It's like a hierarchy of how you get to perfection. And one of the things that it speaks to is the importance of watchfulness in our conduct. That is, that we're kind of always watchful and aware of ourselves. And in Mesilat Yesharim, Luzzatto says that there are three main things which stop us being conscious of our own behavior. One of them is being overly concerned with worldly concerns, right? So, Robert, the answer to your question is, of course, if the thing that's most important is focus on your own behavior and Torah, then being interested in worldly concerns is in tension with that. But the second, he says, the third is bad company, having the wrong friends. But the second is laughter and levity. So a prohibition on laughter and lightheartedness as somehow being in themselves problematic. I've just seen that we've got a comedy producer who's come to join us to study. This is not the text for you, Dan, I don't think. So there's a very strong voice against having fun, against laughter and play in this text. So maybe we'll just take a moment to read it, to just read a little bit of it. Karan, you are next on my thing. If you'd be good enough to just read, but the second type of hindrance is very difficult.
But the second type of hindrance is very difficult. It is laughter and latson. For one who is sunk in these is like one sunk in a great sea, from which it is extremely difficult to escape. For behold, laughter destroys a person's heart until sense and knowledge no longer rule. And behold, that person is like a drunkard or a madman to whom it is impossible to give counsel or to guide them, for they are not able to accept any direction. This is what was said by King Solomon, Alav Hashalom. I said of laughter, it is madness, and of merriment, what use is it? And the sages, Zichronam Livracha, said, laughter and kalut rosh incline a person towards illicit relations.
We just do the next paragraph for us, go on, we'll keep.
Sure. Why is all this the case? Because just like watchfulness involves putting matters at the forefront of the mind, so laughter removes from the mind thoughtfulness and straight thinking, and we find that thoughts of awe do not enter the heart at all. Consider the severity of levity and its destructive power, for just like a shield anointed with oil deflects and drops arrows, causing them to fall to the ground, preventing them from reaching the body of the person, so too is latson before rebuke and reprimand. The power of levity knocks it all to the ground, so it does not make any impression at all on the person.
So we can begin to see how this idea kind of becomes very prominent in some of the thinking within Orthodoxy in particular, but also how it kind of becomes, it sort of becomes associated with a very powerful kind of rhetoric about how we are and who we are. So if our primary purpose, our only purpose is Torah, and really reflecting on our behavior around Torah, then, you know, doing other things is problematic, but also anything that stops us taking that seriously is problematic. I do think we should get Dan a t-shirt made that says laughter destroys a person's heart. I think that would be an excellent gift for a comedy producer. There's a real challenge there about how they understand the things that perhaps we in our lives consider to be really important. And just to give you a sense of how extreme that is, if you go over the page, one of the things that comes out of this is a feeling that abstinence is important. And when we think about abstinence, we think about abstaining from eating too much or drinking or whatever it might be. Just to give you an example of where it gets to, we're on from chapter 13 of Mesilat Yesharim. We will now explain good abstinence. It has now become clear to us, as we wrote and explained above, that all matters of this world are trials to a person. Likewise, we have pointed out the great frailness of humanity and the disposition to evil. It is clear that people should do whatever they can to avoid these affairs, so as to guard from the evil which is at their feet. For there is no worldly pleasure, ta'anug, which does not draw after it some sin at its heel. And when it says no worldly pleasure, a little bit later on it says strolls and conversations, which are not about something forbidden, are certainly permitted according to the Torah. But how much neglect of Torah is drawn after this? How much lashon hara, how many lies, how much levity? It says, where there is much talking, there is no lack of transgression. This is going for an afternoon walk. The general principle, since all world affairs are nothing but great dangers, how could the one who wants to escape from them and strive to distance from them not be deemed praiseworthy? So let's just take a moment. If anyone wants to ask questions or say anything or respond with delight or horror. Michael.
Well, two comments. One is the previous study session with Rabbi Hannah was all about people getting into all sorts of strife because they devoted themselves too fully to Torah and study, and they neglected the fullness of life. So it was a real warning not to devote yourself too much to study. There's one story after another, all in trouble. And then the second comment is the one thing we've told ourselves in Jewish history, the one survival value we've had was humor. And here we are saying that the one survival value for hundreds, thousands of years that Jewish people have had is wrong.
Great. I think there's something deeply challenging about this position, this text, or these ideas of this when it gets this extreme. The interesting thing about the text that Hannah studied with you, so this is a series of stories about rabbis who don't go home to their wives, is that what that speaks to is that there are competing values and competing obligations. Interesting. But primarily around family. So the tensions that articulates is the tension between study of Torah and going home to your wife and your kids. So these stories in which they neglect to go home to their wife for Yom Kippur, or they neglect to go home at all and their kids don't recognize them, those sorts of things. So, but that is another mitzvah that is being ignored, right? So it's not going out, to have fun. But I think there is, I think there is something challenging here for us all around the attitude to enjoyment and the attitude to the everyday life that we live, which we want to try and, we need to try and grapple with a bit. John.
Thanks, Josh. Aren't all these people writing at a time when they are living mostly in the diaspora, surrounded by non-Jewish communities where it would be a danger to try and engage in the world around them? So wouldn't there be a natural inclination to want to actually disengage from the world around you as a safety thing and to study? Mike, as you know, I always try and look at the historical context of these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly possible. It's certainly not, it's not the shut of the text, like it's not what the text is saying. The text is saying there's something, there's something problematic about you as a Jew doing these things irrespective, right? And certainly that, going to the circuses is not problematic because you might meet some non-Jews. It's problematic because you shouldn't be wasting your time at the circus, right? That's Kalat Rosh. Anything that's not Koved Rosh, anything that's not living a life of seriousness is problematic. That's the message that we're getting, the voice that we're getting. Howard, did I see you wave? Yeah, I think I did. Yeah. And then Sandra. Oh, sorry, I just muted you, Howard, prematurely.
Hi. Do you think that there's some degree that this is the monastic life which they're looking for? It's very similar, I think, to many of the aesthetes you find in monasteries. And to what extent might it be that they're actually being influenced, they're seeing by, in fact, what's going on in Christianity? After all, if you were a Rosh Yeshiva, you were pretty poor and pathetic compared to the head of a great abbey. So it would be quite a good thing to encourage, really, a move towards monasticism.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful when we use the comparison with monasticism, only in as much as Michael just alluded to, the Jews are not just allowed, and the sages are not just allowed to have partners, they are obliged to have partners, right? So they are obliged to live family lives and to procreate. So there is an expectation of slightly more balance than perhaps in the monastic lifestyle was expected. Sandra, you wanted to contribute. No, you're still muted, Sandra, I think.
Can't. Oh,
there we go. Great.
No, I was just a bit confused because I thought somewhere I'd read that rabbis had to have a job. It was important that they had something that they could rely on to work with. I know that there are the yeshiva people that go and study, but basically you have to have a job.
So again, I think there's tensions here to be articulated. There is so rabbis are paid to study within the ultra-orthodox world, often, as I say, in Israel by the state, but the obligation is to make sure that certainly there is an obligation to enable your children to also have a trade, so that if that falls down, they can't. They can cope with it. But this is, I think what all these questions are doing is reminding us of the tension that's being articulated. And it hadn't occurred to me that I'm following Hannah's session, which of course is on the same question, which is how do we, how extreme should we be, or how much balance should we have in our lives? That's the question that's being asked here. Lawrence.
Yeah. To what extent is Hasidism sort of a backlash to such an ascetic view of the world? Because I always understood Hasidism to be promoting the joy of life and the joy of Torah, but joy and rejoicing in place of, maybe in place of study, but certainly alongside study.
So certainly there was in the sort of 18th century, 19th century, a kind of a tension between those who understood seriousness in Jewish life as being the seriousness of study and quite a kind of door seriousness, and the Hasidic world, which kind of evolved around the Baal Shem Tov, which was much more about kind of dveikut and joyfulness and engagement in that way, but a very narrow joyfulness. So that joyfulness is the joyfulness of engaging with Torah and with prayer and in those settings, rather than, and the family life, not this kind of broader engagement, not going out to the pub, right? That remains problematic. Okay, so we've got this thing that I've sort of set up a little bit of a straw man, but it's not really a straw man because it's real, which is a voice in our tradition that says we are obliged to live a life of seriousness. And a life of seriousness is defined as one in which we are always on, right? We're always on duty, Jewishly, religiously, in our lives. Any time that we're not studying Torah, we're neglecting Torah. Any time that we're not doing the thing which is really, really important, we are somehow doing stuff which is problematic. Right? That is the tension. That's the kind of thing that's being, the voice that's being expressed. Right? If you're going out for a walk, then you're not studying Torah. Right? If you're going to the pub, you are there in a sitting of scorners. Right? You're in a space which is fundamentally antithetical to that other thing, that vision that you should be doing of what life should be like, which is about seriousness. And even rejoicing, even good rejoicing, has to be associated with or accompanied by trembling. So even the rejoicing of prayer, even the rejoicing of the wedding has to be cut somehow because it's somehow deeply suspicious. That's the voice that maybe is reflected in that idea of Kalat Rosh. And that might be why it's sort of fallen out. So if you turn to page 7, at the top of that page on page 7, what you'll find is a description of some questions around Kalat Rosh from the Eish Torah website. Now, when I say this, this is in no way meant to be Eish bashing, because there's a great deal of the messaging there that's very powerful. But the voice that we heard from Mesilat Yesharim was very important in helping to set up Eish HaTorah, and then you kind of see it on this text, which is why I brought it. So these are the questions that the Eish HaTorah website asks us to ask ourselves when we say Al Chet Shechatanu Lefanecha B'Kalat Rosh. Sometimes we can forget that life is serious. Can you all just check you're muted? Someone is unmuted. Sometimes we can forget that life is serious. We're born and we die. What have we made of our lives? Have we been focused on meaningful goals, or are we steeped in trivial pursuits? Ask yourself, do I spend time reading unimportant sections of the newspaper or listening to frivolity on the radio? Do I spend time with friends and colleagues discussing inconsequential details of sports and entertainment? Do I waste countless hours on the internet with no goal or purpose in mind? And then there's a kind of shift. Do I act with proper reverence when in a synagogue or learning Torah? Do I speak about biblical personalities and our Jewish sages with the proper respect? Now, importantly, these are not all the same idea. So the last two are the way that Kalat Rosh is used in the initial text that we looked at in the Talmud. The next ones are what Kalat Rosh becomes within the way it's used in medieval and modern Jewish text, right? This idea that if we're not doing the thing that's really important, then we are somehow doing something wrong. You know, when I'm listening to the radio or when I'm out with friends or when I'm on the internet, I'm somehow not fulfilling my purpose in my limited time here on earth. Thoughts? Is this a confession you would want to have in your machzor? David. David Brown, and then Michelle will come to you. All right, David.
When I was 18 and traveling around Israel, I somehow found myself spending 3 weeks at Eish HaTorah. And the questions had changed a little. It was pre-internet. It's a very compelling proposition. And I think many people at many stages in their lives find themselves in fairly inconsequential things in their work, in their home life, where binging on Netflix has become almost a trope. So there is something appealing in this.
Great. Michelle, I think you unmuted yourself.
My question is, if you're constantly studying, when do you have time to practice?
To
practice what you've studied.
Right. So, I mean, in terms of kind of your religious life, you would get that balance right. So it wouldn't all be study.
I mean,
so
you
you would
used
also
the
be davening.
you used the example of taking a walk. Taking a walk would be frivolous if you looked at it from I'm not studying perspective, but if you were thinking about what you had studied, or if you were practicing something that you should be doing, perhaps that would be all right.
Right. I think that would be all right in that context. Absolutely. That idea. So it's interesting. I think there is something really interesting here. So I personally, I'm quite sad that Kalat Rosh is not in our book, because I think there is that real question about, maybe not to this extreme, but I don't think it's an unreasonable question to ask ourselves, when have I not taken life seriously enough? Right? And that feels like it's okay. Interestingly, I wouldn't have Latson in my book. I wouldn't have a confession, like the idea that I show contempt for the world by going to the cinema. But I think there is a real thing about, am I taking life seriously enough, which I think has value, which should be there in our reflective practice around Yom Kippur. Noah.
I was just going to ask, since a lot of the confessions in Al-Khet have kind of like opposites, like this and this, which is somehow complementary. Is there seems to be pushing one way in a very extreme way. Is there something that it's pushing against that we have or don't have?
Not in this case. No. It has a complementary partner in the confession on Latson, but not as kind of a push-pull, not a thing in tension. So it's interesting. I think I have no idea why they took Kalat Rosh out of the book. John, go on, and then I'll try and sum up so we can all go for our walk.
Josh, I think what I'm struggling with is that it seems to say that you have to take life seriously all of the time. It doesn't say have a balance, and you should be able to have frivolity as part of your life for some time. That's how you achieve a balance. And this seems to say take it seriously continuously and all of the time. And that's what I find difficult. So I wouldn't want to see in that interpretation in our Maxor.
Great.
Well, Josh,
Dan, go on.
Can I just say, I also think that there's a sort of something inbuilt here, an idea that of seriousness, which is the same as solemnness. And I can't for the life of me see why reading a comic tract or an ancient comedy or anything like this is less intrinsically axiomatically serious than doing something else. It's a view that prevails in the BBC. It's a view that prevails everywhere, that because something may be light or funny, it's therefore not serious. And I think that's an inbuilt thing. There was a missive once that came out around the BBC saying, and we take this seriously right from all the way from high drama all the way down to comedy. And you're going, and I know I would say this, but when David is saying it's a very, this 3 weeks of studying Torah, I have no idea why that is of greater value than of watching something on Netflix. I need somebody to explain to me why that is a case. I know the circular argument of people who say this is the case because we have written this and therefore we are saying this, but I want to know why something that is of, say, popular culture is less serious than a tract that was written 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that you're probably setting up an artificial distinction there by, putting those two things against each other. Because I suppose what we all know that there can be comedy which is insightful and thoughtful and serious and helps us to think differently about ourselves and the world. Of course we do. That's not really what this is saying. What this is saying is, do you watch My Family, I suppose, to kind of, to be very rude about my family. But, those sorts of comedies which are, or the inconsequential surfing on the internet, or, I'm trying really hard not to talk about the fact that my kids are on social media all the time. But, that thing that people do where we waste time. Right? Let me kind of try to draw to a close, and then I'll give one last thought. Because I actually think Kalat Rosh should come back into the book. I think Latson should go out, because I think Latson is problematic, but Kalat Rosh should go back in. I do want to acknowledge that there are some different voices in our tradition. So if you look on page 7, you'll see there are a few different voices there. about how do we think about ourselves in the world. So there is the story that Danny quoted about Rabbi Brocha who used to be in the market, and he would chat with Elijah the prophet there. And once he said to Elijah the prophet, "Are there any people here who have a place in the world to come?" And Elijah said, "Those two over there." And those two people, he goes up to them and says, "What do you do?" And they say, "We're comedians." So this is definitely a text that suggests that comedians have a place in the world to come, rather than the idea that laughter destroys a person's heart. So I think it's important to recognize that diversity of voice in our tradition. One of my favorite self-justifying texts is at the bottom of that page, which is a text from the Yerushalmi, which says that when you, in the world to come, you will be given, asked to make a judgment over every good thing that you sought to eat that you didn't eat, which I kind of use as self-justification somewhat. But the idea that actually there is something valuable in enjoyment and experience of the world. I think the voice that John articulated is there in the Tosefta text, which I think really is the thing that we might want to focus on, which is a text, quote from Hillel HaZaken, which isn't in the Mishnah, it's not in the Talmud, it's only in the Tosefta, which maybe suggests that it's been kind of pushed to one side. But what he says is, do not fear being naked, do not fear being dressed, do not fear standing, do not fear sitting, do not fear laughing, do not fear crying. As it is said, there is a time to cry and a time to laugh. That is that recognition that actually a full life is one which has a balance of different things in it, and that we shouldn't be fearful of trying to have that fullness of life. But I am going to make a case for Kalat Rosh. And the case I would make for Kalat Rosh is partly based on the text at the back page, which is a text about vows. I've not left enough time to do this text justice, but essentially what it gives is a series of different people who make a vow, essentially just taking the mickey out of it. Someone who, the first one is someone makes a vow of cherem. A cherem is a vow of abstinence, and then says, I wasn't making a vow of a cherem, I was making a vow not to use a cherem, and a cherem is also the word for a fishing net. So someone who's just kind of trying to take the mick out of something that's actually serious, and how you deal with it. And the sages say that if someone is in that situation, what you should do is, you shouldn't forgive them, but you should find another way of getting them out of this silly vow that they made. Because so they don't think it's okay to have a kalat rosh with regard to vows. And I would argue that there is a thing here, which is to strip back all of that stuff we just talked about and say, what do we mean when we say someone is approaching something with a kalat rosh? And what we actually mean is not taking stuff that deserves to be taken seriously. And I actually think that's probably one of the things that we as a society struggle most with, which is a kind of a blitheness, a looseness with that which is really important. And I think, if we strip away the latzon from this and ask really what is kalat rosh, the kalat rosh, to say the sin I've committed before you with kalat rosh is actually to say the sin I've committed before you by not taking seriously the stuff that deserve to be taken seriously in my life and in the life of the people around me. Thank you for being with me. Thank you for being with us. This is such an odd thing, God knows, but it's such an odd way to spend Yom Kippur, but I'm so thrilled that so many people are spending it with us. We're taking a little break now until 4:15. The idea of the break is that no one can do what we're doing all day. So you need to go and take a break. You need to go get some air or do something different and be back for 4:15. In order to help you, if you go onto the Eilith website, there is a podcast. There are actually two podcasts. There's a podcast made with our choir of some of the choral music from the High Holy Days. It's actually amazing. It's a wonderful thing. It's really worth a listen. If you want to take it on a walk with you, you can download it on SoundCloud. Did I sound like I knew what I was talking about then? You can download it on SoundCloud, and you can take on a walk with you. It's really wonderful, and it really is worth it. There's also a podcast from our JMM team to help you with some relaxation for the afternoon. No one can do what we're doing all the way through, so take an hour and then join us again at 4:15 for Mincha. Fatima Tova, bye.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Very good thing.